watch. Garrett shaded his eyes, blinking owlishly. Even the diffused, orangey half-light of early evening seemed as bright as midday to him. He supposed that was what came from being inside all the time. Even the open-air practice yard back at the compound never received this much light, enclosed as it was by high, stone walls. He blinked a few more times and grinned to himself. Even with that boring little errand Artemis had for him, this was just what he had needed. Garrett was no social butterfly, but isolation did not do well for him. He could only take so much of the quiet and stoicism of the compound. Here in the old quarter, life was going noisily along its way. Commoners and nobles alike could be found, enjoying the last few hours of sunlight without the oppressive heat of the day. Garrett happily soaked in the sound for a moment before collecting himself and staring down the cobbled street. After all, he did have a job to do, and no matter how much he disliked it, he wanted to get it over with. Perhaps, if he completed this small task for Artemis's satisfaction, he might be allowed out more often. "It is a simple chore I have set for you, Garrett," Artemis said. "But you must first follow my instructions to the letter. Do you understand? Good. Now, there is a certain object that is being delivered to the Hammerite Temple at Fort Ironwood. A chalice. This object is of considerable symbolic importance to the Hammerites, now more so than ever. It was recently stolen en route to the city by a small band of pagans, and the Hammerites have only just recovered it. If the pagans manage to lay hold of the chalice yet again, the Hammerites may go to drastic measures to retrieve it. All you need to do is see that the chalice is delivered to Fort Ironwood. There will be an enforcer nearby who will be overseeing the delivery and dealing with any pagans who might attempt an attack. You will be given the tools to protect yourself if necessary, but only to protect yourself. You are there to observe and keep your mission in action, not to take part in it. The tools Artemis mentioned turned out to be 3 gas bombs, specifically modified to be extra silent. As Garrett neared Fort Ironwood, his blood began to hum excitedly in his veins. True, he was only there to watch, but even that was better than just studying mission reports. He could already hear the clanking armor of a Hammerite garrison approaching from down the street. Carefully fitting himself into a shadowy niche where the sides of 2 large buildings met to form a short, narrow alley, he fixed his eyes on the entrance to Fort Ironwood and prepared to watch the show. Suddenly, an unearthly shriek rent the air. Garrett sucked in a breath and felt his muscles tense. In a split second, his hand found one of the gas bombs, and then nothing happened. He looked around wildly and backed further into the shadows. The cry had been loud enough that Garrett's ears still rang slightly, but the people on the darkening street before him looked as though they hadn't heard anything at all. But why? They should at least be looking around to see what it was. That is, unless... No, that's impossible. I can't. Can't I? Shaking his head to clear his thoughts, Garrett edged carefully out of his corner and into the small shadow at the side of the street. The noise itself had startled him so much that he had no way of knowing where it had come from. Instead, Garrett instinctively began to follow what felt like a trail of panic. Moving slowly, as if in a trance, he mentally felt his way along the trail, which began to lead back into another, deeper alleyway, not 30 feet away from where Garrett had been hiding. As he crept further into the passage, the alarm in the air was so thick he could almost taste it, sharp and bitter. He was so captivated by the feeling that he didn't notice the dark shape on the ground in front of him until he nearly tripped over it. Ducking to see it better, he discovered, to his horror, a human body. Not just any body either, but that of the enforcer Artemis had mentioned. Even through the iron mask, Garrett could hear ragged wheezing. At least it isn't dead. Hey, are you hurt? Can you move? And a gloved hand shot out from the enforcer's cloak, and strong fingers wrapped around Garrett's throat. There was a moment when time seemed to freeze in its tracks. Garrett stared into the black holes of the mask, and for a second, he thought he could see a dim light glinting off of a human eye. The enforcer seemed to study the boy for a moment before releasing him.
Just a novice. It is no threat,
said a dissonant voice that nearly made Garrett jump a foot in the air until he realized that it must be the enforcer's voice. But enforcers didn't speak like the rest of the keepers did. So how the hell had he been able to hear them? You just stay here. I'll go get help. Garrett started to stand, but the enforcer grabbed the hem of his tunic. The movement made the folds of the enforcer's cloak fall away and revealed a bloody abrasion near his left shoulder. The cloth that would have been covering the wound had been burned away, and the singed and bleeding skin around the deep scrape was a sickly yellow-green, as though the wound had been poisoned. "Oh, shit," breathed Garrett.
I know you can hear me, novice, so listen carefully.
Like a bird before a snake, Garrett was entranced.
I cannot finish my task. I have made contact with the other enforcers, but it may be too late. You must find the pagan shaman who attacked me and dispatch her before she disrupts the plan.
Garrett stared open-mouthed at the enforcer, who was now lying very still. He was just a novice. How was he supposed to dispatch the shaman? He didn't even know where he or she was. You know how to dispatch a shaman, Garrett. He did not know how to use the crescent-shaped weapon that now hung useless in the enforcer's hand, but its dagger was still at its waist. Garrett slid the glinting blade out of its sheath and closed his eyes. He listened. The enforcer was no longer breathing. The bustle and clatter of the street was loud, but easily ignored. The Hammerites had reached the entrance to Fort Ironwood. One of them was now holding the chalice aloft and expounding the virtues of the builder. Garrett snorted disdainfully. The Hammerites' leather and iron armor creaked and clacked. There it is. Not far from where he crouched over the fallen enforcer, Garrett heard a voice. It was barely above a mutter, as though the speaker were merely talking to himself or herself, but Garrett heard it. He slipped out of the alley and moved quickly and silently towards the voice. Always in the shadows, he followed the voice until he saw her. The shaman was crouched low behind two crates. Her crooked yew wand in her outstretched arm pointed directly at the Hammerite speaker. Absently thankful that it was a cloudy, dark evening, Garrett snuck up on the shaman and, with only a second's hesitation, plunged the deep blade into the woman's back, just behind her heart. Just that second was enough for her to turn and see her attacker, and Garrett saw her face as she collapsed. Her eyes were huge, and she opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She stiffened, and her eyes rolled into the back of her head without closing. She went limp, and seemed to lean oh so slowly until she fell onto Garrett, blood oozing through her clothes and onto Garrett's hand. He wrenched the dagger out of her back, feeling the blade scrape along her ribs. Like a zombie, Garrett took hold of the body and threw it over his shoulder. He could feel her still warm blood dripping onto his neck and down his back. Taking advantage of the fact that most of the people on the street were still listening to the long-winded Hammerite speech, he jogged over to the alley where he had left the enforcer, only to find himself looking into a blank gray mask. 2 enforcers were now gathered around their comrade's body. A third, who he had almost run into, now deftly took the corpse of the shaman out of Garrett's arms. One of the others lifted the dead enforcer, while the last took Garrett by the arm and led him after the others.
He killed the pagan. The novice completed 7th task. Impressive. But how would he have found her, much less 7th? He could not have heard 7th's call. He has not had the glyph of telepathy set on him. That will be addressed later, 3rd. We will leave it to the elders.
Throughout this exchange, Garrett kept his eyes riveted to his feet, trying to wince at the 3rd's iron grip on his arm. Only the dead enforcer had known that Garrett could hear him. Garrett kept quiet all the way back to the compound's secret glyph door, a dark sense of dread growing in his mind.